With the government setting out a roadmap for return to normality and more people going back to work in the coming weeks and months, then what happens if an employee says that they cannot work because of a childcare issue? If an employer is asking an employee to return to work when that employee's child or children are not yet back at school, for instance. Now, employees enjoy a statutory right under employment legislation to take reasonable time off work to care for a dependent in the event of an emergency. And typically that in a childcare case, that will involve a scenario where the child falls ill and therefore can't go to school, or the childminder falls ill and therefore can't take the children. And usually the time needed is limited to a day or two or a short period of time to allow the carer to put arrangements in place for someone else to take care of the child, and then the employee goes back to work in a relatively short space of time. But in these circumstances, with it being uncertain when certain children will be going back to school, and with childcare arrangements being more difficult, with daycare nurseries closed or operating at reduced capacity, and grandparents not being as available for childcare as they would have been previously, it's quite likely that what would be considered to be a reasonable amount of time for an employee to take off under that statutory right would be considerably longer than in normal circumstances. And indeed, on the 11th of May at the Downing Street briefing, when the Prime Minister was asked about this, he indicated that if an employee could not return to work because of a childcare issue, because a child's school was not open again, or that child was not back at school, then he would consider that to be an obvious barrier to that employee returning to work at that time, and that he thought employers would agree with that. So I think that's an indication of where the government line on this is going to be, and I think it likely that in due course, if there was any tribunal proceedings where this point had to be addressed, that it's quite likely that tribunals would find that in these circumstances what could be considered to be a reasonable amount of time off will be significantly longer than in normal circumstances. And so what's an employer to do if an employee says, I can't come back to work because of a childcare issue? Well, they need to explore that with the employee, try to understand the circumstances, and probably the answer is going to be, particularly with the furlough scheme being extended, if that childcare issue runs into several weeks or even months before that child is back at school, then the best option in most circumstances is likely to be to keep that employee on furlough. And if any employer is thinking that the employee is taking an unreasonable amount of time off to deal with the childcare issue, and wants to treat the failure to return to work as a disciplinary matter, then they need to take great care and take specific advice before proceeding down that road.